Hello, this is going to be a several part lecture on using Chicago style citation on secondary sources. Right? It's going to be several parts because I need to talk a little bit about the theory behind footnoting and sourcing citations, and then I'm going to give you some concrete examples, and I want to make each one kind of separate so it'll be easier for you to use later on if you need to go back for a refresher. So the first issue is this question: why should you cite properly? What's the big deal? Well, first of all, remember how earlier I talked about when you're doing research, one thing you should do is get a recent book and look at the research they did, and then you can use that to know what sources you should read. Right? So when you cite properly, it allows people to know what sources you used so they can use those sources too. Right? That's just kind of basic, be considerate. People want to learn more about what you're studying. You make it possible for them to do so. It also allows people to check to make sure that the sources say what you claim they do. Right? This is very important. Sometimes it's possible that you misunderstand a source. Oftentimes when historians argue about something, they argue about how to interpret sources. You need to go back and actually check those sources. And sometimes people will claim sources say things that they don't. And there have been cases of very historians of very prestigious universities being caught making up sources or citing sources that don't exist and things like that. So it is important that people be able to replicate your research, right? You may know that in science, it's important that people be able to replicate the results of an experiment. And it's similar in history. If someone says, hey, that is interesting that these sources say this might help in my research, I'm going to go check those. They need to be able to find those sources. It also just shows you know what you're doing, right? Sometimes, I'll be honest, sometimes the format, there's not really a good reason why it has to be in a particular way, but we had to pick one way, and we need to stick with that. And when you show that you know the proper format, people say this person knows what they're doing. And usually this is connected to better papers. Typically when someone uses incorrect formatting, oftentimes their paper is also poor and incorrect and not a very good paper. Usually if you can do citations correctly, it's helped you build up a habit of attention to detail, which also goes to writing good papers. So for these and other reasons, you need to learn to cite properly. You want to be very careful about this, right? So you may have heard of History 499, right? Or you may be in that class right now. This is a video I may assign to multiple classes. In History 499, you're supposed to write a paper and present it. And you're expected to write in correct Chicago-style formatting. And just to give you a couple examples, I had a student, and I was assigned to read that student's paper. And they cited a newspaper article. And I thought, really, that newspaper article said that? Well, I'm going to go have a look. Well, they had cited it incorrectly, so it took me a while to find it. It took me about half an hour to find the darn thing. So I was in not a good mood because it's like, okay, this person could not bother to cite things correctly because of that. It took me a while. So I'm going to find this. And she had cited it incorrectly. The newspaper article she had cited said things very differently than what she said it did. And the newspaper articles around it also challenged her argument. So you better believe I gave her a hard time during her defense. In that case, her failure to cite properly made it difficult to find her source and just showed a general sloppiness, which caused her to misread important historical documents. In another instance, I had a student where I looked up their source, and they were very cagey. They kind of were not clear where they got the information from the source, but I found that by looking at it, they in fact had misrepresented the source. We're trying to make it say the opposite of what they wanted it to say. So I also gave that student a hard time. I actually bring a copy of it and said, please read this part here that contradicts what you say it says. So you want to be very careful about this, right? You want to make sure to cite things properly. Now, when should you cite? Well, when you quote someone, when you refer to a particular source, right? If you say that Dr. Ramsey in his book on, the Yamasee says this, you need to provide a quote, even if you're not, or a citation, even if you're not using his exact words. when you summarize someone's ideas, when you refer to numbers. If you say this many people became ill during the 1918 flu epidemic, you need to cite. And if you're not sure, just go ahead and cite it. This is also key to avoiding plagiarism, right? If you bring in a bunch of information taken from someplace else and don't cite it properly, that's plagiarism. And that could lead to failing a class or getting an F on a paper or something like that. And last, I want to stress, do not wait to add footnotes. Please, please do not wait to the last minute to add a footnote. That is a terrible idea. Never, ever do that. Because what will happen is you can't remember where you got that information. So whenever you, and I'll talk more about this later, whenever you like have a quotation, go ahead and add the footnote and just make a reference to what book that came from, maybe what page number it is. You can go through and put in the rest of the information later. But you do not want to say, okay, I've written my paper, now I'm going to add the footnotes. No, you want to add those as you go through. Another issue I want to stress, trust no one. Trust no one. There's a bunch of websites and even word processing programs will tell you that they can put your, if you enter the information, they will put your paper, they'll make your bibliography for you. And a lot of times they're wrong. They don't do it correctly. And you can sometimes kind of copy from university texts, books published by university presses. That's sometimes okay. But it's better to learn the style correctly and then check it. Because a lot of times people make mistakes and it's clear that they have just copied and pasted and they copy and unfortunately the person who put it together, the computer program, did not do it correctly. One thing I also need to emphasize is that there is a different format for the bibliography and a different format for footnotes. They're similar but different. And you need to make sure that you use the bibliography format with the bibliography and the footnote format with the footnote. Do not mix them up. Do not mix them up. Make sure you get them straight.